As I mentioned, this is the first in a four-part interview series entitled Celebrating 80 Years of the Thomas More Institute, Dialogue and Encounter with One Another and the Issues of Our Time. This particular session is called Encountering the Other, Migration and Democracy, an interview with Dr. Mireille Paquet. Now, I was going to tell you a little bit about Thomas More, and I will very quickly, but I see everybody here has had the Kool-Aid, okay? So you know we've been around for a bit, since 1945, and we celebrate in the year 2026 the anniversary of our 80th year. And what we offer here at Thomas More is unique in that we provide a unique space that combines the rigors of intellectual curiosity, intellectual discipline at a university level, but we have the accessibility and the warmth of a community organization. Our mission is to create an environment where adults of all ages gather together to think deeply, question freely, and build community through shared, curiosity-driven learning. What's unique about Thomas More is that our distinctive pedagogical model emphasizes conversation as a learning method, as opposed to the traditional lecture series. We believe that that nurtures both critical thinking and a strong sense of belonging. We offer accessible university-level courses in the liberal arts that invite participants to explore bold questions in a supportive, inclusive environment. While most of our learners enroll for personal achievement, some pursue a Bachelor of Arts degree because of our long-standing affiliation with Bishop's University. Of course, many of you have come here and come to know Thomas More through such events as poetry reading, art workshops, and events like the one we're having tonight. I'm getting tired of hearing my own voice, so let me explain to you how the evening will unfold. Before I introduce our interviewers and our guest of honor, let me just kind of run you through it quickly. There will be a 1-hour recorded interview, after which we'll open up the floor for questions. The question period will last until 8 o'clock. However, you are all cordially invited to continue the conversation over wine until 8:30. Now, if any of you have a cell phone that's in a pocket or in a purse, would you mind turning it off? Always wanted to say that. Now, allow me to present our interviewers. It gives me great pleasure. Let's start with the lovely lady at the end down here. She needs no introduction, but she's getting one. This is Carol Fiedler, and Carol holds a PhD in political science from the University of Chicago, specializing in political theory. Since 2018, Carol has served as the chair of the board of directors of the Thomas More Institute. Carol also serves in a completely voluntary capacity as the president of the Thomas More Institute. She designs courses and is a discussion leader. And this spring, Carol will be offering her annual Shakespeare in the Spring course. This year's edition was entitled Desire and Liberation in a Midsummer Night's Dream and the Tempest. Our other interviewer needs absolutely no introduction either, but Brian McDonough, here you go. Oh boy. Brian was born in 1951 to French-Canadian mother and a father of Irish descent. He grew up in the Hochelaga Maisonneuve working class district of Montreal and obtained an undergraduate degree in communications at Loyola College in 1972. After several years of working with persons with disability in Calcutta, India, he returned to Montreal, where he completed studies in law at McGill University and was called to the Quebec bar in 1984. For 25 years, Brian was the social action director of the Social Action Office of the Catholic Archdiocese in Montreal. In that capacity, he was involved with local community groups, working with recently arrived immigrant families and with persons seeking asylum as refugees in Canada. He was regularly asked to be involved with asylum seeker claims of a credible risk of incarceration or worse if they were returned to their country of origin, as well as persons who were seeking to remain in Canada simply on humanitarian compassionate grounds. Brian is also a former board president of the Jesuit, pay no attention to that, the Jesuit Refugee Service in Canada. For several decades, Brian has been involved at the Thomas More Institute as a course designer and leader, but also as a member of the TMI Board of Directors. He continues to serve on many committees. And the last thing that Brian wrote, and this is what I want to really key on, he cherishes the many friendships he has been able to establish over the years here at the Thomas More Institute and appreciates the Institute as a center for lifelong learning. Now, our guest of honor is Dr. Mireille Paquet. Mireille Paquet is a political scientist and professor at the Department of Political Science at Concordia University, where she holds the University Research Chair on Immigration Policy. She is the director of the Institute for Research on Migration and Society at the Concordia University and leads several projects under the CF-REF research program, Bridging Divides, Immigrant Integration in the 21st Century. Dr. Paquet's work focuses on comparative immigration policy and examines the role of bureaucracies in shaping immigration policy, changing attitudes towards specific immigration programs, and political debates surrounding the use of technology in the immigration sector. That's it for me. Carol, Brian?
Mireille, on my behalf, but on behalf of all the people I gathered, I want to thank you for being here tonight. It's really an honor to have you. And just kind of an opening question. How did you yourself get involved in immigration policy? A very timely and important question, but how did you yourself come to this area of inquiry?
Thank you so much for the invitation. I did not know about the Thomas More Institute before your colleague was nice enough to invite me. And since then, I've been charmed not only by the people in the room, but also the arts collection. I just can't get over it. So, I do encourage you to do a showing or something. But to answer your question, I grew up in Sherbrooke in the Eastern Township. My parents were from Quebec, my dad from Île-d'Orléans. We spoke about that. And I really didn't know much, I think, as most people who are not of immigrant background, about migration and about the system and the dynamics that lead people to move. Up until in high school, a group of refugees arrived in my high school. Sherbrooke was one of the core region for welcoming state-supported refugees at the time, and we got a lot of young people coming from ex-Yugoslavia, and they all arrived in my high school. And to me, that was first off, they were all very good looking. So, that's important because we often have prejudice about who are migrants, right? There's an idea that they are racialized, they are poor, they are, they just are in not good physical shape because of the trials they had to endure. And while the young people who came to my high school also had to deal with very stressful and horrible destruction, what was so surprising to me is that they looked like me and they actually listened to the same music as me. They, for the first year were in class de francisation, but very quickly joined my own normal classroom. And so this made me curious about migration, but it also made me realize that it's something that can touch everyone, right, including me. So listening to their stories, becoming friend with these young people really changed my life, and so created this lifelong curiosity. And I was lucky when I was 25, I was able to go to Sarajevo to see the city, and so for me that was a really intense moment to be able to see the kind of physical mark of the conflict and hear about the stories that my friend had told me. But you know, I think those friendship and just learning about the reality of what they had to go through in high school really, shaped my destiny. So
Wow.
yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Mireille, people here are persons who read the news and seek to be up to date on public affairs. But my experience is that few people really understand the difference between, for example, the government's policy regarding immigration, and on the other hand, the reality of the program that we have for refugees, refugees and asylum seekers. And I was wondering if you, perhaps with the chart that you had prepared, would be, would you have it?
Yeah, you prepared the chart.
I know.
I have it.
You have it,
We
but-
photocopied the chart,
no,
we did not prepare it.
I think it can help us better understand a little bit, what immigration is.
Yeah.
Who are the different actors?
Yeah.
Who are the different government actors?
Yeah.
How the feds and the provincial government interact with them? And on the other hand, where are responsibilities to welcome refugees come? The different aspects of that refugee program. I think it would really help us all to be able to understand some of the different things, including, as we'll say a few minutes ago now, the whole evolution in Quebec regarding its role as receiving immigrants. And so
that's a great question. Maybe I'll cut it into two. And so I'll
Fantastic.
start with a concept and you can ask me about the chart
Okay.
again. Okay,
Got
so
it.
that I don't lose my train of thought. So
we'll do.
one of the big finding in the social sciences, because that's what I've been studying empirically using observational studies, using online surveys, and I'm not the only one, is that we collectively, right? So it's not just me, it's not just you. We tend to be very fuzzy, like our thinking tends to be pretty fuzzy when it comes to migration, because most of us don't have first-hand experience, and also because the policy and the legal frameworks are really complex. And so, just to give you an example, a couple of years ago, we ran a study on Canadians just after the Syrian refugee operation in Canada, asking people what was a refugee, what made a person a refugee, and the answers were not at all what the law says a refugee is, and there were also tons of stereotypes about what refugees look like, whether they're to be trusted and all of that. And so I think that when we're having these discussions, it's always really important to acknowledge this fuzziness and to kind of just go over a couple of concepts to make sure we all understand what we're talking about. So a really central lesson from years of studying migration politics is that there's actually not a clear definition of what's a migrant. So in international law, there is no such a thing as an international convention on migration. There's a global compact, but it's not binding. And countries vary tremendously in how they define a migrant or an immigrant. So they often use different words also to talk about this. So, in basic sociological term, we can think of a migrant as someone who crosses an international boundary. But then again, some of the people who do so will be labeled as expats, right, or tourists, or like so. So this term is very difficult to kind of decide on, and so or to agree on. So for the sake of our discussion, we can assume that anyone who kind of crossed an international boundary with the goal of settling in a foreign country, either short-term or long-term, can be categorized as a migrant. But that tells us not a lot about why they would do that, right? Do they do that because they want to go to Fort Lauderdale for the winter? Or do they want to seek protection in the country? And that's where these other definitions then come into play. And so in our politics, I think we tend to make a difference between migrants and refugees. And in international law, there is a difference. So if we don't have a definition of who is a migrant, we do have a definition of who is a refugee according to the convention and a protocol. The definition is super long, so I'm not gonna, it's a person owing for like, but anyone who's seeking protection and is not in a position to receive such protection in their country of origin. So the convention gives those kind of like broad criteria and then leaves to signatory state the right to interpret that definition. So I don't know if, I'm sure I have a couple of lawyers in the room. So you, any show of hands, so that I'm not being, okay. It's not too
very
bad.
safe.
Yeah, very safe. Okay. Yeah.
Good guy.
This means that in countries there are adjudicators. Either they're in Canada we have an administrative tribunal who makes decision on refugee claims, or in other countries like in the US it's just judges, and in other cases it's bureaucrats who look at files of people who have crossed international borders and who say, I'm here because I want protection on the basis of the criteria of the convention, who say, yes, you fit the criteria, no, you don't fit the criteria. This definition is very time bound. And by that I mean that it's a definition that was created after the Second World War to deal with the humongous displacement and the large number of non-status people that came out of the conflict. But that means that there's a lot of new risks that are not taken into consideration. Right. So the convention thinks about protection in terms of political persecution, persecution on the basis of ethnicity, religion, all the things that we saw during the Second World War. But it doesn't cover things like poverty, right? So being poor is not considered to be, or being deprived is not considered to be a reason to claim refugee status. It doesn't take into consideration climate displacement. It now takes into consideration gender and sexual orientation and sexual identity, but that took a long time and a long work for adjudicator to kind of come to that interpretation. And so I think we can maybe think about it as a very kind of minimalistic definition. It's like a part of the people who in our heart or in our head we would consider as refugee will be captured by this definition and recognized as such. But a lot of people that we would label migrants also come in our countries for protection. It's just not under kind of a set of criteria that makes sense for the definition we have. And I think it's especially important to kind of make that difference now because countries were doing an okay-ish job, right, implementing the convention up until, let's say, 10 years ago. States in general, I'm a professor of political science, so that's what I say to my students all the time, states do not want to be told what to do, especially not by international law, right, because it's seen as something that calls into question their sovereignty. Same goes for the Refugee Convention, because in a way, deciding who comes in and who has the right to stay is seen as like a core thing that sovereign states do. And the convention says to states, you have to not accept David, but at least take into consideration his claim for refugee status. And that is something that a lot of countries don't want to do because they know it's not popular with voters, because they know that people have a lot of prejudice. So they try to do as much as possible to try not to extend that definition. And there used to be in the old world, maybe 5-10 years ago, this kind of name and blame and shame thing in which this country was not doing a good job protecting the refugees. Therefore, we would talk badly about them. But this is now gone out the window, and a lot of countries, including the United States, do not really implement the convention anymore, which means that we're starting from a very limited tool, right? It was a very minimalistic tool, and now we're in a world in which what it means to be a refugee, honestly, if we met in 5 weeks, I'm not sure I would be able to tell you. It's very frightening. So, but those are the two differences, right? So migrants and refugees. Migrants is kind of anybody who moves, and then states decide whatever that means. And then refugees still organized around the convention, but increasingly this definition is eroding. So
I just want to ask you something, because often in the media, we hear references to economic refugees.
Yeah.
Do you want to help us understand why economic refugees are not necessarily protected under the convention?
But exactly. So this has been very visible during the refugee crisis following the Syrian uprising and then civil war. So European countries were saying, well, the people who arrive on boats are not refugees, they're economic migrants. Which I think if your country's at war, like, not sure, but okay. But again, there's an attempt by states to paint certain groups as not being refugees or not being, like deserving of protection, because states do not like, it's horrible, and I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but states do not want to take in migrants in general, and refugees even less. So the most that can happen in our politics where states are going to say these people are not deserving of our help, they are just coming for work, they're coming because they want to steal jobs and things like that, well then they are that's and I trying to be polite when talking about this, it's really hard, but I think that some of you might have parents or grandparents that were migrants themselves. And I think that if you think about the reason they came to this country, it likely was something like a mixed motive, right? I'm sure they were poor back home, but I'm sure also there might have been a little bit of like, political unrest as well, a little bit of unsafety, right? So how do you disentangle what is the most important there? So, yeah.
Thank you for that clarification.
Yeah.
Now we have, however, policies regarding the welcome, indeed the selection of immigrants. And I understand that different levels of government have rules regarding immigration policy.
That's right.
Can you help us understand that a little bit?
Yeah. So my interviewer was nice enough to take an excerpt from an article I published last year, which has a table that present what's the job of Quebec and what's the job of Ottawa. So Canada is unique in the world in which we have immigration as a shared jurisdiction in the Constitution. So no other federation globally has that, and no other country also. And fun fact, it comes from the historical, the colonial dimension of the pre-Confederation period. So all the colonies that wanted to come into Confederation were very involved in bringing in settlers, right? So New Brunswick, Ontario, they all had like offices in Europe, offices in the US trying to recruit people. And they saw that as their job because they wanted to have the best colony. And so when Confederation started, they were like, we're keeping that. Like, we want to bring the best people. And so that made it into the Constitution. The other areas of jurisdiction that's shared officially is it's agriculture. So it's in the same article. But so what that translated into modern Canada is that the federal government does a lot of the immigration law. And then provinces can do integration services. And Quebec, as I'm sure you know, was not satisfied with federal immigration law because they perceived that it was too Anglo-centric and was, not allowing Francophones to come in. So starting in the 60s, they demanded powers. And in 1991, an agreement was signed, still in place. And so it divides who does what. And that's my tiny take on this. So, I can go really quickly.
Yeah, please.
So
I think it would help us.
So in Quebec, and so that's not the same in Ontario. Okay, so but in Quebec, the Quebec government is responsible for selecting every permanent resident in the economic category. What that means is that anyone who applies to become a permanent immigrant in Quebec on the basis of their education, skills, work experience, first has to apply to Quebec. Quebec says yes, no. If it says yes, then the person has to apply to Ottawa. Then Ottawa does all the kind of like, verification for are you are you a criminal, are you sick, and all of that. And then Ottawa, like the federal government, gives the final okay and the permanent status and the permits and all of that. For other categories of migrants, it's a little more complicated. So for example, state community-sponsored refugees, which I'm sure you know, that used to be like the Quebec government was kind of doing a pre-selection for groups of fives and people like that. Now there's a moratorium on this program, very sadly. Quebec also has a role in the selection, selection is not the right term, but let's say picking up the refugees that are pre-selected abroad, let's say in refugee camp or in a situation of displacement. And then when it comes to integration, so a big part of the game for Quebec was getting the capacity to integrate migrants into the French language. Mm-hmm. Part of that was made through Bill 101, education, but part of that also ended up being done through providing services to migrants in the French language. And so they were able to negotiate with Ottawa that it would only be the Quebec government who would provide integration services for immigrants in the province, whereas in the rest of the country, it's mostly federal governments who is doing it. As a condition, Quebec receives a large chunk of money. Like honestly, it's the largest chunk of money. It's like so huge. It's huge because it was the agreement, the 1991 agreement was signed just after Leech Lake. And so the federal government was so concerned because some of you might remember that this was when even Robert Bourassa was like, I'm going to separate. And they were like, whoa. So they were very willing to do anything that they could do. Like the federal government was really willing to do anything they could do to appease the Quebec government. So they designed this funding formula that basically cannot go down. So even if Quebec receives less, it's like the best deal ever. Like it's like even if Quebec receives less migrants, the funding keeps going up. Okay, so it's an order of but so this has allowed Quebec. So for us it's good. It's allowed Quebec to really build a unique fabric of integration services, French language courses, really invest that money traditionally, maybe less now, but traditionally in the community sector. So we have a very active, very strong community sector who's responsible for migrant integration. Mm-hmm. So yeah.
Do you want to perhaps help us look at the genesis of the 91 Accord between Canada and Quebec? I mean, you were alluding a few minutes ago to events starting in the 70s and a number of other things that actually created, or in our Quebec context, an awareness in the population about the importance of an increased role by the Quebec government in the selection of refugees for economic purposes, and not refugees, but I mean immigrants and also the considerations regarding the selection of immigrants. Do you want to help us?
Yeah, sure.
You talked in your article about those different eras.
In very schematic ways.
Yes, indeed.
So in that article, and that's also, I wrote a book about kind of the history of, it was my first book, it's the history of how provinces, so not just Quebec, but other provinces also came to want to do more in immigration. But one chapter was on Quebec, the most exciting story, like a lot of things in Canadian federalism. So in that, in that work, I kind of divide the history of immigration politics in the province into 3 phases. So the first phases is kind of, after Confederation up until the 60s, or up until the Quiet Revolution, where there was a real kind of concern about immigration, like a very feeling of threat associated with migration. Duplessis was very anything that was not Catholic. And migration was there, right? So migrants were still coming, and we have like signs of this all over the city. But the provincial government didn't see this as something that they wanted to do and they should do. They saw their job as, protecting la nation québécoise. It was la nation canadienne française back then. And so that was this kind of phase of latency and kind of non-interventionism. And as with a lot of things in Quebec, starting in the 60s with the Quiet Revolution, then this idea that, actually, maybe we could be more proactive, and instead of, and that's their language, not mine, but instead of subir like l'immigration, instead of being just kind of victim to whoever was coming, the government of Quebec could become a proactive actor in deciding who arrives and then how these people integrate. So that starts in the 60s, become much more visible in 68 when the Quebec government creates its first immigration department. So first province in modern history in Canada to have a department. It's actually interesting, fun fact also, it's the only Quebec department that's in Montreal. Right, its office is in Montreal, which, this tension, obviously, but it used to be on McGill Street in the old part, a very beautiful building. Now they moved downtown, next to, on Saint Laurent, next to Monument National and Bar Cléopâtre, if you know that. And there's a food court in the basement, of course. And so it's also super interesting with this idea that like migration occurs in Montreal and not in Quebec. And so they created that department, and then they started doing things that might seem obvious to us now, but they opened an office at the airport, right? And so I have some pictures, I should have brought them, but like of like, kind of a Expo 67 type ladies were smoking with a little hat and like welcoming people at the airport, like, hello, you're in Quebec, welcome. And so, and at the same time, the province also started to provide services to migrants, which build onto kind of the development of the welfare state in Quebec and all of that. And it's at the same moment that provincial premiers started to demand power from Ottawa. So there was a succession of agreement. And what was interesting during that period is that all the parties were really like into debating migration. So it wasn't about like pro or against, but they were just like talking about it, right? Like, what's the best way to do it? So it was very positive, but it was very salient in the politics. And so that goes on until 91, where finally that agreement that's still in place comes into place. And then I argued in my book and in other places that then that kind of brought a period of kind of consolidation and boring politics. Like no one talked about this. It was like, we got the money, we got the power, we're just doing business as usual. So, and what happened during that period is that the province started to welcome more migrants. So it was a steady, but, slow growth of the population of migrants. Most of them were now either Francophone or, like close to learning French. And that kind of stays like that up until, I would argue, 2018, where things like kind of started to shift a little bit. And so, parties wanting to rethink that division of power with Ottawa. So when CAQ came into power in 2018, they were the first party since the 80s saying they want to reopen this agreement and they want to like claim more power from Ottawa. They were also the first government to bring down the immigration intakes, whereas like they had been incrementally growing since the 90s. So, I'm not here to say whether that's good or bad. I think we can all debate this, but we can see that we're in a new phase right now. We're in a new era of this politics in which, a lot of things are moving.
Wow.
Yeah.
Carol.
Yes. So I'm going to take over and I'm going to look a little bit more at this. So this was extremely helpful on the definitions and on the history. And I'm going to look a little bit more at that intersection between democracy and migration. And, as I said to you in your office when we
Yeah.
met a couple of weeks ago, it seems to me that democracy is both the best news in the world for immigrants
Yeah.
and also the worst news in the
Yeah.
world for immigrants, right? It's the best news because, oh my goodness, they have human rights, they
Yeah.
have constitutions, they're going to be able to practice their own religion and talk freely, and they won't be persecuted by the state. Sounds fantastic. But then on the other hand, in democracies, electorates
Yeah.
are very vulnerable to demagogues, and demagogues are often looking for wedge issues
Yeah.
where they can find a victim to blame, and immigrants often become, and especially lately, the victim.
Yeah.
Your healthcare would be so much
Yeah.
better. Your welfare system is in trouble because
Yeah.
of immigrants. There's no housing because of immigrants, and on and on and on. So, I thought I'd pick up with where you guys just left off. You were talking about the transition between the second era, which is kind of that nice boring era. And, as an American, I can say that boring is really a wonderful thing. Anyway, that's just an aside. Yes, bring that boring. It should be a slogan. But from that era of consensus to the third era, which is, and you in your article, I don't know if anyone had a chance to read it. It's a wonderful article. If you got it, read it in the following days. It's really, I love that article. And you speak in particular about how it wasn't, there were things that were going on. There were discussions about multiculturalism. We all remember the Bouchard-Taylor Commission, and let's move to interculturalism and so forth. But despite those things, and despite the fact that there was talk about immigration or talk about multiculturalism, there wasn't a feeling among the people that this is an issue that has to be dealt with. But instead, you argue that it really happens in 2012 when we move from having two parties who are active to having three parties who are active. The CAC appears on the scene. And it's at that moment that immigration starts to be an issue. And your argument in this article is that does not come from the people. It doesn't come from down below. It comes from the political elites.
Yeah.
It's seeded by the political elites. And so I'm wondering why is it you think that it happened in 2012? And part of me, the political scientist part of me, wants to ask this nerdy question, like, is there something about having a political system that has, instead of two parties, has three parties? What happens there, right? You have nothing against nerdy political scientists, right? Or was it something about the CAC and what they wanted, and the issues they thought they could make hay with, that they could really have success with? How do you read all of that?
So much to say about this, so hopefully I don't speak too long.
Okay,
Just do it.
Okay.
So
I got a whole bunch of questions.
So what I talk about, because there's been the process that Quebec has gone through and Canada is going through right now, by the way. So we're calling this kind of the politicization of migration. And so we've learned a lot from what happened in Western Europe, in the last 15 years. So it was kind of easy to see the same playbook going on. People were very, around 2015, in Europe, there was this big debate among political scientists because two things happened at the same time. There were arrivals from Syria, so the things that was dubbed the migration crisis. And then there were also the rise of right-wing parties, the appearance of populist parties, and a lot of these actors were using migration centrally in their platform. And so then the question becomes, are these two things related, right? Which one are basically parties doing what they're supposed to do, which is reflect the reality of the world? Or so what is we care very much about that as especially empirical political scientists, what's the direction of causality? So a lot of people did a lot of studies to understand, in a country X, if you have X number of refugees arriving, does that increase the possibility of a right party to win? Does it change their positioning? And controlling for all sorts of other things, like the economy, the state of the economy, the level of party competitions. And the surprising finding that was very robust across Western Europe was that refugee arrivals was not the driver of that, right? I know. It was instead party competition. And so that led to what we call amongst ourselves top-down explanation. So elite-driven explanation of politicization. So what they found in the case studies time and time again was that parties saw that migration was an issue that could allow them to win an electoral advantage as opposed to traditional parties, right? So if traditional parties were like, we're the party of the center right, we're like big business, low taxes, great, and you're a traditional kind of social democrat, or like just like the welfare state and social justice, like how do you find a place within that configuration of traditional party? Well, the strategy is often to like bring up something that the two other parties have no kind of position on, right? Or you're just bringing something on the agenda and saying like, this is the most important thing. And so this has two advantages. The first one is that it kind of allow you to become differentiated very quickly. And we live in an era of democracy where people don't pay attention. And I'm sure you know this, like on a phone, where like, things go very fast. So you need to have a brand, right? It's not about your idea. You need to have a clear message, a clear identity. And so deciding on like finding your issue and like just claiming it, like allows you to become knowledgeable and like legible. But the other thing that's really interesting about migration in particular is that most traditional parties don't take positions on immigration because they are coalitions. And because they are coalitions, some of their supporter and core voters are pro-migration and some are against migration. And the strategy to manage this, which is kind of what Canadian parties in general do also, is just like to not talk about stuff, and then like keep it like very broad. And then that way we don't have to address the issue because we know we're never going to get, or we assume that we're never going to get to an agreement. When the third party enters the race, what happened, and they start talking about migration, is that they force the two traditional parties to respond. All of a sudden, they need to be able to say something about migration. And when they do that, they fragment their electorate. So they lose some of their traditional voters going to the new party just because they now have a position. Like if I had known that the Parti Libéral thought this, I would have never voted for them, but I didn't know that for 20 years. And so this has been the playbook time and time again. And we saw the same thing, or at least that's what we argue. We saw the same thing going on in Quebec, right? So used to be Parti Québécois, Parti Libéral, and CAQ arrives and it's like, they're not gonna win on the nationalist front, right? There are coalitions, some of their supporters are for, against separation. They're not going to win on the business side. That's the brand of the Liberals. So what are they going to do? They're looking for some of those wedge issues, and they were able to win on that. I'll just add another thing, is that this research on politicization has also shown that if we survey citizens about what are the most important problems, even in moments like the refugee crisis, migration is never in the top 5. Like most people don't think about migration. I do. But like all of you, like it's not like people think about the economy, their taxes, their healthcare. And so what researchers have found is that it's by the presence of messaging, like elite messaging over time, then migration becomes salient for voters, right? So it's by being told that this is a problem that then it becomes, or it becomes much more visible and salient. And so then we can think of this process I just described as a 2-stage process, right? First is the entering into the arena and like, kind of divide and like force your opponent to do things. And then there's the maintenance of the message, who then kind of like keep up this issue on the political agenda, which is what we've seen in our last 2 elections in Quebec, right? Migration has been really high on the agenda. I don't think, not mostly because voters like opinion surveys time and time again show that that's not what people care about. Like they care about getting a family doctor, right? But then if the incumbent and all the other people are talking about migration, then that becomes the issue, and it's very sad. you know? And I want to say that I want to talk about this, but it's okay if you think that we need to have more strict migration policy, right? Like, it's not a criticism of the ideology, it's just to understand the mechanism by which this occurs.
Yeah, no, that was really
Excellent, yeah.
interesting,
Yeah.
thank you. So I want to move from that question about the three parties, which is really fascinating, to the question of governance.
Yeah.
So how well can democracies govern, given this kind of an environment where there's such politicization? And so in the case of the issue of immigration, which became a hot button issue from the 2018 election on, although it really started building prior to that. What do we see on the effect on policy? So how well does policy do? Like, we all know that democracies in general are not good at long range planning, but well, that's a good point. But when we politicize a policy area, then long range planning and rational planning becomes very difficult. Is that what's, can we, in recent in the last few months, we've been hearing a lot about the cancellation of the Programme Expérience Québécoise and the effect of that. And we know that certain parts of that have been, taken back and so forth, but not entirely. Could you speak a little bit about the costs of politicization?
Yeah, it's a big question. Because so the traditional mode of making migration policies in democracies is something that we call client politics. So that means that it's not really discussed in election, but instead it's like the people who are having the most to gain from migration policies who are trying to kind of convince government to do what they want, and then government is trying to develop immigration policy to serve them as clients. And so usually that's an alliance between business and like business as employers, people who benefit from migrants as a like labor force in the government. That model is not politicized, but it's also not very democratic, right? And so it's like, I used to think, oh, it's better, but like it's better for some people, but it doesn't really allow us to advance migrants' rights. It doesn't really allow us to kind of like have discussions about how we want to be a society that welcomes migrants. But this model of client politics has tended to, favor kind of long-term planning and kind of like incremental policy change and all of that. And so in this new politicized moment, depressingly, we don't really talk about the real issues having to do with migration. We talk about it, but we talk about other things. But it does tend to lead to more policy punctuation and changes, right? And so far, I don't really know what the solution to this is. And what's interesting, one of the things I liked the most about Quebec is that people have ideas. And so in the last election, people were really fighting over what's the right number. I don't know if you remember this, like what's the seuil and all of that. And then people were coming up with, like, Jean-François Lisée of all people was like, we need to depoliticize the seuil, So we need to create a commissaire, like somebody who would not be not an elected official, but like a researcher. It's a joke.
Hopefully with federal money.
Maybe, but like, so there are models, like where you could decide that for a more technocratic model, but then again, you lose some of that democratic dialogue. And the issue is, as you say, is that minorities are never treated well by democracies in general, and migrants do not have the right to vote until like a lot of time, until a long period.
And they'll never be a client until they don't need immigration policy.
Exactly. And so then the question is like, how do you design a system? I don't have a good solution to that, but I have to say I'm also not satisfied with the previous model.
Thank you for bringing that extra texture to the argument. You said we don't talk about the real issues, right? I want to move on to that because you said something very interesting. Again, in the Quebec piece, it was in French, but it was shorter. It's really, really rich. I love the other one too, but I'm skipping over it because we only have so much time. You said that we are now living in a media ecosystem that has an emphasis on opinion. And that because of that, a lot of things have changed. And so, I'm wondering to what extent this kind of has been an added portion of how the issue of immigration and other issues have become, made into a partisan issue and not aided the course of democracy, but aided the course of demagoguery.
I agree.
Yeah.
Yes.
So
but I can
say a little bit about the media ecosystem.
Well, I'll just even take it even further. So first, we all know there's just a lot more opinion in the news, and so opinions have to be more kind of divisive in order to sell newspapers, and so we just have more voices. We just finished a paper that's not published yet, but looking at the kind of evolution of editorial content, like op-eds and things like that in the Quebec media on migration. And so it looks both at the kind of rate, like how much in a newspaper are over time since the 80s and really has increased, but also the emotional intensity of those texts as opposed to the news is also, so it's also much more emotional language. So that plays a role. It's not just in Quebec, we see it I don't know if you've read the Globe and Mail lately, but they also are really going in that direction. But your question also made me think of another thing that we often don't talk about, but that is increasingly important, is that foreign interference in democratic processes is using migration as a way to divide our polity. And the case of Brexit was very, very evident for that. The Canadian government doesn't talk too much about this, but we know for a fact that this is also happening in Canada. So, and this again kind of asks a question are we talking about the important things? Not is this debate even something that our people, that our polity wants, or is this something that's being catapulted by bots, by agents, and I just I don't have a good answer for that, but to me that's very important. And I think this raises a lot of question about the integrity of our electoral processes in general and our democratic processes.
We're entering a new era for democracy.
We're deeply in it already.
And it's dangerous for immigration, but it's dangerous for lots of other things too. Absolutely. So we've talked a bit about the French and what's going on, in Quebec. But as you mentioned earlier, it's not just the CAQ has a stricter immigration policy, right? The federal government under Mark Carney has recently lowered the amount of students who could come, the amount of worker permit holders. They've been, 47% down, the students down by 61%. They're now putting up this top talent program, which is, speaking of clients, for business, designed for business, is designed for the government too, because they want to have pilots and they want to have soldiers and or high level military people coming as well. Now, we could argue that when we look at this policy, both from the CAQ and the federal Liberals, whatever we might have said about it in 2012, that at this point, they're really responding to what they're hearing. Right? They're hearing about the housing crisis, they're hearing about a healthcare crisis, they're hearing about social cohesion. So that's a fair read of the situation, do you think?
It's a big question. So you're right, I think that they're responding to what they're hearing. It's not always clear whether what they're hearing is the right causal link. So by that I mean that there's not been yet a paper that has demonstrated that migration has caused the housing crisis, right? So it's the discourse is there quite evidently and are trying to be responsive, but the other part of the equation is not as clear.
So that's exactly my question. As a pragmatic matter, it makes me wonder, is it best for, if you have a party that's kind of center-ish, maybe even center-left-ish, and they care about immigration, they even want to sort of minimally help refugees and asylum seekers a little bit, and they say to themselves, am I better to have a little bit of control on immigration, to come out on the same side of the issue, kind of as the conservative parties that want a complete moratorium on immigration, so that I don't get get cut off
Yeah.
from the other, an angry electorate that I have my place.
Yeah.
Or the other thing that, perhaps would be useful would be, should I be giving actual reasons? Should we be talking about policy?
Yeah.
If all this has been seeded from elites, can elites seed the opposite? Can we show we need immigrants? There is a reason. We see what's happening in the United States just south of us. There are going to be refugees. How are we going to, that sort of thing. I don't know what the answer is.
Yeah, I don't know. Well, so I think that Carney is doing exactly what you're proposing.
Yeah.
Right? I think that he's seeding and like kind of presenting a much more restrictive approach.
Yeah.
So on like immigration levels, so targets on a lot of things. And I also want to be upfront that like we've just been through a unique moment in Canadian history, right?
Yeah.
Like whether we like, I'm always pro-immigrant, but we have grown the population so quickly after the COVID. And there was never as much population growth in a short time than like at Confederation or something like that. Like, it was like just like tremendous, right? So something happened. Like I think it's not fair to say, oh, everyone is just being like completely gaslit and like, manipulated. So that's one reality.
Yeah.
I think that's also a failure of kind of thinking through the infrastructure that are needed for this population growth.
Yes.
We can chat about that with wine. But so I think wine. Yeah, wine. Yeah. So I think that is true. We need to acknowledge that, right?
Yeah.
But it doesn't mean that we don't have the resources, right? So it's kind of a different discussion. But yeah, I think Carney is trying to do this, kind of, walk this line. I think that he's also trying to do something which is, I don't know if it's wise, but there are bigger fish to fry. So he's kind of trying to bring it back to this kind of client mode of politics by saying, we kind of took care of it. Now let's focus on trade, which is like the big issue.
Yeah.
This hope that, they're going to be able to kind of like close the door on that.
Yes.
But the difference is that the conservative who were very, very disciplined in the last two elections not to talk about migration.
Yeah.
Because they were like, internal memo was like, you don't talk about it. Now it's free for all. And so they're facing an opponent that's different, and that's going to ask them to, first off, like the Liberals, whenever there's an election, will be seen as the reason everything is not working. And then they're going to have to defend or like to act in relation to a liberal party that's like building on the Trump playbook when it comes to migration. So for that, I don't know like how the party will react. You can invite me next time.
Yeah. Talk about it in 4 years. I'm going to hand it back to you.
Yeah. I have a question, Mireille. A couple of decades ago, we were really concerned about the different regions of Quebec that were losing their population. The régions se vident, we were talking about that. And there was, how should I say, at that point, a political will to be able to get immigrants, because otherwise, the different regions,
Se vide,
that is, fermé, the whole kind of structure. What happened to that?
Yeah, well, les régions se vident encore.
I know,
Right,
that's why I'm asking.
The government that is just ending its term in Quebec,
Yeah.
CAQ, has really put in place dramatic intervention to try to bring out more migrants outside of Quebec, outside of Montreal. And I was just actually writing a paper this afternoon on the bilan de la CAQ, and they actually succeeded.
Whoa.
Part of what they did was that they did not allow temporary work permit to be issued in Montreal. So a lot of people had to go outside. They made it, there were a lot of advantages, basically, if you wanted to be in région. But at the same time, the government also lowered immigration target dramatically. So while the redistribution of migrants is better, the overall number is not as big. And with like, there's also been a very, and I'm again not saying this in the ideological matter, it's just sociological diagnostic, that the cancellation of PEC and the end of study permit is doing reputational damage, like dramatic reputational damage to Quebec, which already struggled to bring in the people it wanted for the language, because of the language question. So, the bilan demographic of the province has been in the negative for years, but that bilan demographic has really gone down in the last 3 years, and it is going to become an issue of sustainability,
Wow.
right? Like I'm talking like 5 years, it's not that far.
No.
You can't do babies in 5 years, right?
No.
Like if you want to invest into making babies, it's a 20-year strategy. So we're talking essential work not being done, or talking issues in the healthcare sector. Yeah, it's pretty dramatic. And so, you know, yeah, it's not, it's that is the thing that keeps me up at night.
This reason.
Yeah.
That's a perfect segue, because
Yeah.
the question that we wanted to ask you is, like, for you at this
Yeah.
point, what are the burning questions in this area? I mean, you hinted at twice in the last
Yeah.
2 minutes, but what are the burning questions in this area of academic inquiry?
So my policy question is,
Yeah.
how do we deal with the demographic future of Quebec? And that's my next project. I'm not sure yet how I'm going to study it, but I
Wow.
think that it's complicated because we don't want to force people to have babies, right? Like it's nothing good comes out of it's impossible. So what do you do, right? And this question is important because there's a global demographic degrowth. So it's not just in Quebec, like all over the world there's less people. So okay, so that's one thing. And the second is that's something that I started working on and I'm continuing to work on, which are delays, backlogs and delays. So in the immigration system, the time spent waiting is expanding. So it's not just lowering, like one of the things that the government did is that it's not just lowering immigration levels, but it's making it increasingly harder to negotiate bureaucratic processes. There was an article in La Presse last week that said that if you're recognized as a refugee by the federal government, Quebec takes about 7 to 10 years to issue your certificat de sélection du Québec.
That's it.
Right now, to get a hearing at the IRB with the federal government is between 2 to 6 years. So you could be on a precarious status in Canada for 16 to 17 years. So what does that do to your relationship with the state?
Wow.
Like, what does that do to your trust? Like, we're talking about citizens of the future. So I'm like, really, but it's hard to convince the average citizen that the delays in immigration are more important than the delays in getting a family doctor or getting a knee surgery. Right? And how do you manage this? So that I'm really concerned about that. And then the last thing is AI and migration. Because what we're seeing, the same that we're seeing like slop, you know, like all this like weird content being like AI is also allowing the creation of so much fraudulent documentation in the immigration process, and it's also allowing people to apply like all over the world at once, which, you know, from a human capability, great. Yeah. From an administrative processing, impossible. So how are our government gonna kind of address this like kind of wave of files coming in their way and remain true in their processing? Like, you know, do okay decision. I don't know.
Wow.
Yeah.
Thank you very
Yeah.
much.
These were good questions.
Yeah, well, wait till you hear the group here.
Well, now